The fastest way to discover who someone truly is to watch what they do when they think they are about to get everything. I learned that lesson on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my wife asked a judge to give her $8.5 million and my family's ranch. My name is Wyatt Carter, and until that day, I thought I understood exactly who Melissa was. We had been married for 14 years. 14 years of birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, long drives across Texas back roads, and countless mornings drinking coffee on the porch overlooking Carter Ranch. If you had asked me 6 months earlier whether our marriage would survive, I would have said yes without hesitation. Looking back now, I realize certainty can be dangerous. It blinds you to things you should notice. The divorce papers arrived by certified mail. Even now, I remember the sound of the envelope hitting the kitchen table. The ranch house was quiet that morning. Rain tapped gently against the windows while gray clouds hung over the rolling fields beyond the property. I opened the envelope expecting paperwork. What I found instead felt like a declaration of war disguised as legal language. Melissa was seeking half of nearly everything. That alone was not shocking. Divorces often involve difficult negotiations. What stopped me cold was the section that followed. She wanted a claim to Carter Ranch, not just financial assets connected to it. The ranch itself. I read the paragraph 3 times before I fully understood what I was looking at. Carter Ranch was not simply real estate. It was history. My great-grandfather purchased the original land more than 100 years ago. Generations of my family had worked that property. Every fence line, every pasture, every weathered barn carried memories. My father learned to ride horses there. So did I. Family photographs filled the walls of the ranch house documenting a century of birthdays, weddings, harvests, and hard years survived together. The ranch was never just worth money. That was the part Melissa seemed unable or unwilling to understand. Later that evening, I sat alone on the back porch watching the rain move across the fields. My attorney, Daniel Brooks, had already reviewed the filing. He was experienced, careful, and rarely surprised by anything. Yet even he sounded concerned. The financial demand is aggressive, he told me over the phone. But the ranch claim is what worries me. Can she actually do that? I asked. A brief silence followed. She can certainly try. Those 4 words stayed with me. She can certainly try? The next few weeks felt like living inside a story that no longer made sense. Melissa and I communicated mostly through attorneys. Every new filing seemed more ambitious than the last. The number attached to her demands remained staggering. $8.5 million. Investment accounts. Property interests. Additional assets. And always the ranch. Every discussion eventually returned to the ranch. Friends started calling. Family members heard rumors. Some offered support. Others offered advice. A few quietly suggested I prepare for the possibility of losing part of the property. Those conversations frustrated me more than I cared to admit. Not because people were being cruel, because they were speaking as though the ranch were merely another asset on a balance sheet. It was not. One afternoon, I drove across the property alone. The sky was clear for the first time all week. Sunlight stretched across hundreds of acres of open land. Cattle moved slowly through distant pastures. The wind carried the familiar scent of grass and earth that had defined my entire life. I stopped near an old oak tree that stood at the edge of the original property boundary. My grandfather used to bring me there when I was a boy. He would tell stories about droughts, market crashes, and difficult years when keeping the ranch alive seemed impossible. Yet somehow the family always endured. Standing there, I realized something important. Melissa's lawsuit was not simply about money. It was about leverage. She believed the ranch represented my greatest vulnerability. In many ways, she was right. A few days later, another round of legal correspondence arrived. This one was even more direct. The demands remained unchanged. The tone had become more confident. Reading it felt less like negotiation and more like someone calculating how much they believed they could take. Daniel called that evening. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I have been better." He laughed quietly. "That makes 2 of us." Then his tone shifted. "There is something else you should know." I waited. Melissa's legal team seems extremely confident. About what? Everything. That answer bothered me more than it should have. Confidence by itself means nothing. Yet sometimes confidence comes from information. Information I might not have. As darkness settled over the ranch that night, I found myself staring out the same porch window my father once used. Across the fields, distant lights marked the edges of neighboring properties. The ranch looked exactly as it always had. Strong, permanent, unchanging. Yet for the first time in my life, I felt the possibility that someone might try to separate my family from something that had survived for more than a century. And somewhere behind Melissa's growing confidence, I could not shake the feeling that a piece of this story was still missing. Over the following month, I found myself spending more time walking the ranch than sleeping. Every acre seemed to carry a memory I had never fully appreciated until someone threatened to take it away. Carter Ranch covered nearly 3,000 acres of rolling Texas land, stretching across fields, grazing pastures, creeks, and wooded sections that had remained largely unchanged for generations. My great-grandfather bought the original parcel with money earned hauling cattle across the state. My grandfather expanded it. My father protected it through difficult years when drought nearly destroyed everything. By the time it reached me, the ranch had become more than property. It was family history written directly into the landscape. One Saturday morning, I drove out before sunrise. The air was cool, and a layer of fog hovered above the fields. As I crossed the eastern pasture, I remembered riding beside my father in an old pickup truck when I was 10 years old. He used to tell me that land was different from money. Money could disappear overnight. Land carried stories. At the time, I thought. It sounded like something older people said. Now I understood exactly what he meant. Later that afternoon, my sister Rebecca stopped by the ranch house. She had heard enough details about the divorce to be worried. We sat at the kitchen table while coffee cooled between us. "Do you think she really expects to get part of the ranch?" she asked. Apparently. Rebecca shook her head. "That place has been in the family for over a century." "I know. There has to be something protecting it." I wished I shared her confidence. The problem was not what felt fair. The problem was what could happen inside a courtroom. Fairness and outcomes do not always travel together. That evening, Daniel called again. His tone was professional as always, but I could hear concern beneath it. Melissa's attorneys submitted additional valuation reports. Let me guess. They think the ranch is worth even more now. Something like that. I leaned back in my chair. How bad? Daniel named a number. I stared silently at the wall for several seconds. The estimate exceeded what I expected. Not because the ranch lacked value, but because the figure transformed it from family property into a target. Large numbers change the way people behave. They create ambition where there was once restraint. They are positioning aggressively, Daniel continued. Very aggressively. Do they actually think they can win? Another brief silence followed. They certainly act like they do. After the call ended, I walked outside. The sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, leaving long shadows across the fields. In the distance, cattle moved slowly toward a water source. Everything appeared calm. Yet the legal battle surrounding the ranch seemed to grow larger every week. A few days later, I attended a mediation meeting in Dallas. Melissa arrived with her legal team. It was the first time I had seen her in person since the divorce filing. What surprised me most was not her anger. It was her confidence. She looked completely certain of the outcome. Throughout the meeting, she barely spoke directly to me. Most communication passed through attorneys. Numbers were discussed. Proposals were exchanged. Property lists were reviewed. Yet every road eventually led back to the same destination, the ranch. At one point, one of Melissa's attorneys said, "Our position remains unchanged." Daniel calmly replied, "We understand your position." Good. The attorney smiled. Then we should not waste time pretending otherwise. I noticed Melissa smiling slightly beside him. That expression stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Not because it was cruel, because it suggested certainty. Certainty based on something. Information. Strategy. Confidence. I simply did not know which. During the drive home, I found myself replaying every conversation from the previous several months. Small details started resurfacing. Certain comments Melissa had made before the divorce. Questions she asked about ownership structures. Interest in family records she had never cared about before. Individually, none of it seemed important. Together, the pattern felt different. By the time I reached the ranch, darkness had settled across the property. I parked near the main barn and sat quietly inside the truck. Something about the entire situation felt incomplete. Melissa's confidence, her attorney's certainty, their fixation on the ranch. It all seemed too deliberate. As I looked toward the old structures scattered across the property, a strange memory surfaced from years earlier. A conversation with my father. A locked safe. a set of documents he insisted should never be misplaced. At the time, I barely paid attention. Now, for the first time in years, I found myself wondering exactly what had been inside. The memory refused to leave me alone. For the next several days, I found myself thinking about that conversation with my father more than anything happening inside the divorce proceedings. The strange part was that I could not remember the exact details. Only fragments remained. A summer afternoon, the smell of dust and hay, my father standing near the old equipment barn, and his voice telling me that some things mattered too much to trust to memory alone. At the time, I was in my 20s and more interested in expanding ranch operations than discussing paperwork. Now, years later, those forgotten words felt unexpectedly important. Meanwhile, the legal pressure continued increasing. Every week seemed to bring another document, another demand, another valuation report prepared by Melissa's attorneys. Daniel kept me informed as new filings arrived. None of the developments were encouraging. "They are building a very aggressive case," he told me during one phone call. I noticed. "They believe the ranch should be included in the marital estate." I stared across the pasture outside my office window. "And they sound confident. Extremely confident." That word again. Confidence. It appeared everywhere. Melissa's attorneys displayed it. Melissa herself displayed it. Even people outside the case had started assuming the outcome was inevitable. Friends who normally avoided discussing legal matters suddenly offered opinions. Neighbors asked careful questions. Some family members quietly prepared themselves for bad news. The worst part was not the possibility of losing money. It was watching people begin to accept the possibility that Carter Ranch might no longer belong entirely to the Carter family. One afternoon, I attended another mediation session. The atmosphere was colder than before. Professional, polite, completely devoid of warmth. Melissa sat across the conference table wearing an expression I barely recognized anymore. At one point, her attorney outlined their latest proposal. The numbers filled several pages. Investments, accounts, property interests. Then, once again, the discussion returned to the ranch. "Our position remains unchanged," her attorney said. Daniel folded his hands calmly. "Noted." Melissa finally spoke. "This does not have to be complicated, Wyatt." Her tone was almost friendly. Almost. "Then why does it feel complicated?" I asked. A brief silence followed. She looked away first. The meeting ended without progress. As I walked toward the parking garage afterward, I realized something important. Melissa was no longer negotiating as though she hoped to reach a compromise. She behaved like someone expecting victory. That difference mattered. Victories are anticipated. Compromises are discussed. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Storm clouds gathered across the horizon. Wind pushed dust across the road. By the time I arrived home, the property looked almost exactly as it had when I was a child. The same barns, the same fences, the same distant tree lines stretching across the land. Yet now every familiar sight carried a different weight. That evening, I decided to visit the oldest section of the ranch. Few people went there anymore. Several storage buildings sat near the original homestead, including a weathered structure my grandfather used decades earlier. Inside, old equipment occupied most of the space. Shelves held records, tools, and boxes nobody had touched in years. I spent nearly an hour searching through documents, photographs, and family records. Most had nothing to do with the divorce. Yet something kept pushing me forward. Instinct, curiosity, maybe desperation. I was not entirely sure. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a heavy metal cabinet tucked against the far wall. The sight triggered another memory. Not a complete memory, just enough to stop me. My father had opened this cabinet once while explaining something about family records. I remembered watching without paying much attention. Back then, legal documents seemed incredibly boring. Today they seemed much more interesting. The cabinet itself contained nothing remarkable. Ledgers, tax records, old insurance paperwork. Yet while sorting through its contents, I discovered something unexpected. A small handwritten note tucked inside an envelope. The handwriting belonged to my father. I recognized it immediately. The note contained only a few words and a location. Nothing else. No explanation. No context. Just enough information to point towards somewhere else on the property. My pulse quickened slightly. Across the ranch, thunder rolled in the distance. Outside, rain began tapping against the roof. I stared at the note for a long moment. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was unrelated to the divorce entirely. Yet after months of unanswered questions, even the smallest clue felt significant. More importantly, the note connected directly to the memory that refused to leave me. The memory of my father mentioning documents that should never be lost. As darkness settled over the ranch that evening, I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my pocket. For the first time since the divorce began, I felt something unexpected. Not confidence, not relief, possibility. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and drove directly to the location written on my father's note. The coordinates were not precise, but they pointed toward one of the oldest sections of Carter Ranch, an area few people visited anymore. The road leading there had not changed in decades. Mesquite trees lined portions of the path, and the same weathered fences I remembered from childhood still marked property boundaries. As the truck rolled slowly across the uneven ground, I found myself thinking about my father. He was never the type to leave instructions without a reason. If he had hidden that note, he expected someone to find it someday. The question was why. By the time I reached the location, the sun was beginning to rise over the horizon. Golden lights spread across the fields, illuminating an aging storage building that stood alone near a cluster of oak trees. The structure had once been used to store equipment long before modern facilities were built elsewhere on the ranch. I parked nearby and stepped outside. The morning air felt cool and still. For several moments, I simply stood there looking at the building. Nothing about it appeared unusual, yet something told me I was exactly where my father intended me to be. Inside, dust covered nearly every surface. Old shelves lined the walls. Rusted tools hung from hooks that had not been touched in years. At first glance, the place seemed abandoned. I spent nearly an hour searching through boxes, cabinets, and storage containers. Most contained records too old to matter. Maintenance logs, supply invoices, equipment manuals, interesting pieces of ranch history, but nothing connected to the divorce. Frustration slowly began replacing optimism. Maybe I had misunderstood the note. Maybe I was chasing memories because I wanted answers badly enough to invent them. Then I noticed something odd. One section of the wooden floor looked newer than the surrounding boards. The difference was subtle. Most people would never have noticed it. But I grew up repairing structures across this property. Small details stood out. Kneeling beside the boards, I examined them more closely. The wood was not new, exactly, just newer than everything around it. Someone had replaced a section years ago. My pulse quickened slightly. Using a nearby tool, I carefully lifted one edge. Beneath the boards sat a small metal compartment built directly into the floor. It was not large, barely enough space for a few documents. For several seconds I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. Inside rested a locked metal box. My father's memory returned immediately. The safe, the documents, the warning that certain records should never be misplaced. I sat back slowly. For the first time since the divorce began, I felt as though I had stumbled onto something significant. The problem was that the box remained locked. I searched the compartment for a key, but found nothing. No instructions. No explanation. Just the box itself. Despite the disappointment, I felt strangely encouraged. A week earlier, I had nothing except questions. Now I had a mystery connected directly to my father's note. That was progress. Later that afternoon, I called Rebecca and described what I found. "You are serious?" she asked. "Completely. Did Dad ever mention it?" "Not specifically." She was quiet for a moment. "Actually, there might be something." My attention sharpened immediately. "What?" "After Mom passed away, I remember Dad moving some personal items into the ranch house office. He spent an entire weekend organizing old family records. And he carried around a small ring of keys for months afterward. That information might have meant nothing. Or everything." The following day, Rebecca drove to the ranch. Together we searched through old drawers, cabinets, and storage areas inside the main house. Hours passed without success. By late afternoon, both of us were exhausted. Then Rebecca opened an old desk compartment hidden behind a stack of family photographs. Inside sat a small envelope. Written across the front were 3 simple words. "For Wyatt." My hands actually trembled as I opened it. Inside rested a key. Nothing else. No letter. No explanation. Just a single key. Rebecca looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us spoke. We already understood. Somewhere inside that locked metal. I waited until sunrise before opening the box. Not because I lacked curiosity. Because some moments deserve patience. After spending months watching my life become a legal battlefield, I wanted a clear mind when I finally learned what my father had considered important enough to hide. The box sat on the dining room table, while morning light filtered through the ranch house windows. Rebecca joined me, equally curious. Neither of us knew what to expect. Old records, property documents, family letters, maybe nothing useful at all. I inserted the key and turned it slowly. The lock opened immediately. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then I lifted the lid. Inside were several documents arranged neatly in protective sleeves. Some appeared decades old. Others looked newer. The first page contained legal language I did not immediately recognize. The second included property descriptions. The third referenced family trusts and ownership structures. The deeper I looked, the more confused I became. Nothing jumped out as dramatic. Nothing looked like the miracle solution people imagine in movies. Yet one thing became obvious almost immediately. My father had been extremely organized. Every document included dates, signatures, and supporting records. Whoever assembled this collection had done so carefully. Rebecca leaned forward. Do you understand any of it? Not yet. Is it important? I looked at the stack. Dad thought so. That alone made it worth investigating. Instead of drawing conclusions, I called Daniel. An hour later, he arrived at the ranch carrying a briefcase and enough caution to fill an entire courtroom. We spread the documents across the dining room table. For nearly 2 hours, he reviewed every page. Sometimes he paused to read sections multiple times. Other times he compared one document against another. The longer he worked, the quieter he became. That caught my attention. Daniel was rarely quiet. Finally, he removed his glasses and looked directly at me. Where did you find these? Hidden on the ranch. Hidden intentionally? Very intentionally. He nodded slowly. Then he returned to reading. Another 30 minutes passed before he spoke again. This is interesting. Those words may sound ordinary, but when spoken by an attorney during a divorce case, they carry weight. Good interesting or bad interesting? I asked. Daniel smiled faintly. Potentially very good interesting. Rebecca and I exchanged glances. For the first time in months, genuine optimism entered the room. Daniel spent the remainder of the afternoon making copies and taking notes. Yet whenever I asked specific questions, he remained careful. Almost frustratingly careful. I need time to verify everything, he said repeatedly. Do not get ahead of yourself. That advice made sense. Still, I could not ignore the change in his attitude. For months he approached every development with concern. Now there was something else beneath his professionalism. Confidence. Real confidence. The following week brought another round of settlement discussions. Melissa's legal team requested one final negotiation session before the court hearing. Daniel encouraged me to attend. Why? I asked. Because I want to see something. What? Their confidence. The answer seemed strange at the time. It made more sense later. The meeting took place in a downtown Dallas office building. Melissa arrived with the same certainty she had displayed for months. Her attorneys appeared equally comfortable. As discussions began, they presented another settlement proposal. The numbers remained enormous. The ranch remained central. Nothing had changed, at least on the surface. Throughout the meeting, I noticed Daniel watching carefully, not speaking much, observing, measuring reactions. At one point, Melissa's lead attorney leaned back confidently and said, "We believe our position is extremely strong." Daniel nodded. "I can see that. Then perhaps your client should reconsider further litigation." I expected Daniel to push back. Instead, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely noticeable, yet I recognized it immediately. It was the same smile he wore whenever he already knew something other people did not. For the first time, I noticed uncertainty flicker across the opposing attorney's face. Just briefly, then it disappeared. The meeting ended without agreement. As everyone gathered their materials, Melissa finally looked directly at me. "You should think carefully about what happens next." Her tone suggested she was offering advice. Not a threat. Advice from someone convinced victory was inevitable. "I have been thinking carefully for months," I replied. She seemed surprised by the answer. Outside the building, Daniel and I walked toward the parking garage together. The Texas heat felt almost overwhelming after hours spent inside conference rooms. "You enjoyed that meeting more than I did," I said. Daniel laughed quietly. "Probably." "Why?" He looked toward the city skyline. Because people become predictable when they think they have already won. I stopped walking. Are you finally going to tell me what is in those documents? Daniel considered the question. Then he shook his head. Not yet. You are impossible. Maybe. His smile returned. But trust me, let them keep feeling confident. As the court date moved closer, Melissa's confidence continued growing. Her attorneys acted like the outcome was already written. Friends whispered that I looked calmer than expected. Family members asked if I knew something I was not sharing. The truth was simple. I still did not know exactly how this story would end. But for the first time since the divorce began, I knew one thing with certainty. Somewhere inside those documents was a reason Daniel had stopped worrying. The court date arrived faster than I expected. After months of filings, negotiations, expert reports, and endless legal correspondence, the day that had dominated my life finally appeared on the calendar. I woke before dawn and stood alone on the porch overlooking Carter Ranch. The sky was still dark. A cool breeze moved across the fields while distant lights marked the boundaries of neighboring properties. For a long time, I simply looked at the land. The same land my great-grandfather purchased. The same land my father protected. The same land now sitting at the center of a courtroom battle that seemed larger than money. I thought about everything that had happened during the previous few months. The divorce filing. The demands. The mediation sessions. The growing confidence of Melissa's legal team. Most of all, I thought about the documents hidden by my father. Even now, Daniel refused to discuss every detail. He had verified them. He had researched them. He had spent weeks preparing. Yet whenever I asked direct questions, his answer remained consistent. Trust the process. Attorneys love that phrase. Clients usually hate it. By 8 o'clock that morning, I was sitting beside Daniel inside the courthouse. The building felt exactly like every courthouse in America. Quiet hallways, neutral walls, serious faces, people carrying folders that represented some of the most important moments of their lives. Melissa arrived shortly afterward with her attorneys. She looked composed, confident, relaxed. If she felt nervous, she hid it well. Her legal team appeared equally comfortable. They greeted one another with the ease of people expecting a favorable outcome. Daniel noticed it too. See what I mean? He whispered. About what? Confidence. I followed his gaze. Melissa's lead attorney was laughing with one of his associates. Not the laughter of someone preparing for a difficult fight. The laughter of someone who believed the result was already decided. A few minutes later, we entered the courtroom. Judge Margaret Holloway presided over the case. She carried herself with the calm authority that comes from decades on the bench. The proceedings began routinely. Introductions. Preliminary matters. Procedural discussions. Nothing dramatic. Yet beneath the formal structure, tension remained constant. Every person in the room understood what was at stake. Over the next several hours, testimony and arguments unfolded. Financial experts discussed valuations. Attorneys debated asset classifications. Records were reviewed. Exhibits were introduced. At times the conversation became highly technical. At other moments surprisingly personal. Through it all, one theme remained unchanged. The ranch. Melissa's attorneys returned to it repeatedly. They emphasized value, appreciation, contributions made during the marriage. They spoke confidently and at length. More than once, I noticed them glancing toward the judge as though they were reinforcing conclusions already accepted. During a short recess, Daniel remained unusually calm. How are you feeling? I asked. Good. Just good. He smiled slightly. Very good. That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it increased my curiosity. When court resumed, Melissa's side continued presenting its case. Their arguments were polished, professional, convincing. At one point, I looked around the courtroom and wondered what an outside observer might think. If someone had walked in without context, they probably would have assumed Melissa held the stronger position. Her attorneys certainly behaved that way. So did she. By late afternoon, the judge reviewed several final submissions before scheduling the next phase of the proceedings. As people gathered documents and prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. Melissa's lead attorney approached Daniel directly. You still have time to settle, he said politely. Daniel smiled. Thank you for the suggestion. I am serious. The attorney adjusted his briefcase. This could end much less expensively. Daniel's expression never changed. I appreciate your concern. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet after the attorney walked away, I noticed something important. For the first time all day, Daniel looked almost amused. What? I asked. Nothing. That is not nothing. He glanced toward the courtroom doors. People only offer last-minute settlements when they believe they understand every card on the table. The statement lingered in my mind throughout the drive back to the ranch. The hearing had gone exactly as Melissa's team expected. Their confidence remained intact. Their strategy remained unchanged. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Yet Daniel appeared more relaxed than at any point since the divorce began. As evening settled over the property, I stood once again on the porch overlooking the fields. Court would resume soon. Decisions were approaching. The pressure should have felt overwhelming. Instead, an unexpected calm settled over me. Somewhere inside the legal battle unfolding around Carter Ranch, a shift had already occurred. Melissa just did not know it yet. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized the next time we entered that courtroom, the conversation would no longer be about what she wanted. It would be about what the documents actually said. The second day of court began with the same confidence that had followed Melissa and her legal team throughout the entire case. As I walked into the courthouse alongside Daniel, I noticed them gathered near the entrance reviewing documents and speaking quietly among themselves. Their expressions looked relaxed, comfortable, certain. If the previous day's proceedings had shaken their confidence at all, they hid it exceptionally well. Daniel noticed them too. Interesting, he said. What is? I asked. They still think the story is about valuation. I frowned. And it is not. He smiled faintly. Not anymore. That was all he said. By now, I had accepted that extracting information from Daniel required more patience than negotiating cattle prices during a drought. Once court began, the morning proceeded much like the previous day. Attorneys presented arguments. Witnesses answered questions. Financial records were discussed in exhausting detail. Melissa's side remained focused on asset distribution and property interests. They spoke with the confidence of people following a script that had worked perfectly up to this point. More than once, I caught Melissa glancing toward me. Not angrily, almost curiously, as though she could not understand why I seemed calmer than expected. The truth was simple. A few weeks earlier, I had been terrified. Back then, every legal filing felt like another step toward losing something my family had spent generations protecting. Now, for the first time since the divorce began, fear no longer controlled the room. Around midday, Melissa's lead attorney completed a lengthy presentation concerning the ranch. He spoke about valuation reports, ownership interests, and marital contributions. His delivery was polished and professional. When he finished, he sat down looking satisfied. Judge Holloway reviewed several notes before turning toward Daniel. Counselor, do you wish to respond? Daniel stood slowly. The movement itself seemed unremarkable. Yet something changed inside the courtroom the moment he rose. Confidence shifted. Attention sharpened. Even Melissa appeared more focused. Daniel began calmly. No dramatic speeches. No emotional appeals. Just facts. He reviewed portions of the record already established during previous hearings. Then he moved toward a subject that had received surprisingly little attention until now. Family ownership structures. Trust arrangements. Historical property transfers. The conversation became technical almost immediately. Yet I noticed something important. Melissa's attorneys stopped looking comfortable. Not alarmed. Not yet. But definitely less comfortable. Daniel continued asking questions. Clarifying timelines. Establishing dates. Confirming details already supported by evidence. The judge listened carefully. Across the room, Melissa's legal team started consulting one another more frequently. Small whispers. Quiet notes exchanged back and forth. For the first time, uncertainty appeared. During a brief pause, Daniel approached our table and opened a folder. Inside sat copies of the documents recovered from the locked box. Seeing them again sent a strange feeling through me. For months, the case revolved around assumptions. Now everything seemed to revolve around paper. Ink. Signatures. Dates. Records preserved long before anyone imagined this courtroom battle would exist. Daniel selected one document and placed it aside. Then another. Then a third. He organized them carefully before returning to the podium. The judge glanced toward him. You have additional exhibits? Yes, Your Honor. Melissa's attorney immediately stood. We have not seen these exhibits introduced previously. Daniel nodded politely. They were disclosed appropriately and within the required timeline. The judge reviewed several filings. After a moment, she nodded. Proceed. The room became very quiet. Daniel approached the witness stand and began establishing foundation for the records. Nothing dramatic happened. No gasps. No sudden revelations. Real courtrooms rarely work that way. Instead, tension built slowly. Methodically, each answer created another question. Each question narrowed possibilities. Several times, I looked toward Melissa. Her expression had changed. The confidence remained, but now it competed with something else. Concern. Her attorneys appeared equally focused. The easy smiles from earlier had disappeared entirely. Hours passed. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt completely different from the one that existed that morning. Nobody was celebrating. Nobody looked comfortable. Even spectators sensed that something important was approaching. Yet the key document remained untouched. Daniel had not introduced it, had not mentioned it, had not even referenced it directly. He was building towards something, layer by layer, fact by fact. When court finally recessed for the day, Melissa's lead attorney requested a private conversation with Daniel. The request alone surprised me. For months they had projected absolute confidence. Now they wanted discussions. That mattered. Outside the courtroom, Daniel listened patiently while the attorney spoke. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. When it ended, Daniel returned carrying the same calm expression he always wore. What was that about? I asked. Settlement possibilities. I stared at him. Yesterday they wanted me to surrender. Today they want to talk settlement. Apparently. What changed? Daniel looked back toward the courtroom doors. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he reached into his briefcase and briefly touched the folder containing the final document. The one he still had not introduced. Nothing changed, he said quietly. They finally realized something was already there. As we walked toward the courthouse exit, I glanced back one final time. Melissa remained inside speaking with her attorneys. Their conversation looked tense, focused, urgent. And for the first time since this entire battle began, they no longer looked certain they understood how the story would end. The final day arrived with a strange sense of calm. Months earlier, I would have spent the morning imagining worst-case scenarios. Now, as I drove toward the courthouse, the anxiety that had followed me for so long seemed distant. Not gone completely, just replaced by something stronger. Trust. Trust in the facts. Trust in the records my father preserved. Trust in Daniel. Most importantly, trust that the truth had a way of surviving even when buried for years beneath assumptions and legal arguments. When I entered the courtroom, the difference was immediately obvious. Melissa's side no longer projected effortless confidence. They still looked professional, still prepared, but the certainty that had defined them from the beginning was gone. In its place sat caution. The previous day's proceedings had accomplished something important. For the first time, they realized there were parts of the story they did not fully understand. Daniel noticed it too. Different atmosphere today, he said quietly. A little. Good. We took our seats. Judge Holloway entered moments later, and the proceedings resumed. The morning began with several procedural matters before moving directly into the issues that had dominated the case from the start. Ownership, classification, historical transfers, family interests. The subjects sounded technical, but everyone understood their significance. Every discussion pointed toward one question. Did Melissa have a valid claim to the ranch? Her attorneys continued defending their position. They argued professionally and thoroughly. Yet each argument now seemed accompanied by an invisible question mark. The certainty was missing. Around midday, Daniel finally stood and approached the podium carrying a thin folder. I recognized it immediately. The folder. The document. The one he had protected throughout the entire case. The one hidden inside a metal box beneath the floor of an old building on Carter Ranch. The one my father apparently considered important enough to preserve for decades. Suddenly, every conversation from the previous several months seemed to lead toward this moment. Judge Holloway looked up. Counselor. Daniel nodded. Your Honor, we would like to introduce one final exhibit. Across the room, Melissa's attorneys immediately became attentive. One reached for a notebook. Another adjusted his glasses. Even Melissa seemed to sit slightly straighter. The document was handed to the court. Then copies were distributed. For several seconds, nothing happened. The silence felt almost surreal after months of conflict. Judge Holloway began reading. Her expression remained neutral, professional, difficult to interpret. Then she reached the second page. Her eyes moved more slowly. She turned another page. Then another. Across the room, Melissa's lead attorney requested a copy. As he reviewed the contents, the confidence disappeared from his face completely. He looked at one of his associates, then back at the document, then toward Daniel. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Sometimes paper speaks loudly enough on its own. Daniel remained calm. Your Honor, as the court can see, the ranch ownership structure was established years before the marriage and reinforced through legally documented family trust provisions. The judge continued reading. Daniel proceeded carefully. Methodically, he explained how the records connected. Historical transfers, trust protections, supporting documentation, signatures, dates, verification records. Every question that had lingered throughout the case suddenly had answers. Clear answers, documented answers, verified answers. Melissa looked confused at first, then concerned, then something else. Realization. For months, she had believed the ranch represented the strongest part of her case. The document revealed the opposite. It represented the weakest. Judge Holloway spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the records. The courtroom remained remarkably quiet throughout the process. Even spectators seemed to understand they were witnessing the turning point. Finally, the judge looked up. Counsel, have these records been independently verified? Daniel nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Supporting documentation was provided immediately. Melissa's legal team reviewed the materials again. Longer this time. More carefully. Yet the result remained unchanged. Facts do not become weaker simply because someone dislikes them. One of Melissa's attorneys attempted to challenge portions of the document. The effort lasted only a few minutes before the underlying records answered the objections directly. Every path seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. The ranch had protections none of them anticipated. Protections established long before this divorce existed. I sat quietly listening while the final pieces fell into place. Surprisingly, I felt no triumph. No urge to celebrate. Mostly I felt respect. Respect for my father. Respect for the generations before him. Somewhere in the past, they anticipated challenges they would never personally see. Then they prepared accordingly. As the afternoon continued, Judge Holloway asked additional questions and reviewed final arguments. Yet the atmosphere had already changed. Melissa's side no longer looked confident. They looked resigned. The case they spent months building around the ranch was unraveling page by page. And as I watched the judge place the document carefully among the court records, I realized something remarkable. The most powerful moment in the entire battle had not involved a speech, an argument, or a dramatic confrontation. It involved a piece of paper quietly telling the truth after everyone else had finished talking. The judge's ruling arrived 2 weeks later. Those 14 days felt longer than the previous 6 months combined. Once the courtroom battle ended, there was nothing left to do except wait. No additional arguments. No emergency filings. No negotiations. Just silence. The kind of silence that allows every possibility to occupy your mind at once. During that time, I spent nearly every day on the ranch. I repaired fences, checked livestock, reviewed operational plans, tried to focus on ordinary responsibilities. Yet no matter what I was doing, part of my attention remained fixed on a decision that would shape the future of everything around me. One afternoon, while standing near the same oak tree my grandfather used to visit, I realized something surprising. The fear that once dominated my thoughts was gone. Not because I knew the outcome, because I had already done everything possible. The truth was in the record. The documents existed. The facts were clear. Whatever happened next would not be determined by assumptions or emotions. It would be determined by evidence. In a strange way, that brought peace. The call finally came on a Thursday morning. Daniel's name appeared on my phone while I was checking water systems in the northern pasture. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then I answered. Well, I asked. Daniel laughed softly. Good morning to you too. Daniel, you won. The words settled over me quietly. No dramatic rush of emotion. No celebration. Just relief. Deep, overwhelming relief. Daniel continued explaining the details. Judge Holloway's ruling addressed every major issue raised throughout the case. The family trust structure remained valid. The historical ownership records were upheld. The protections established decades earlier remained enforceable. Most importantly, the ranch stayed exactly where it had always belonged. With the Carter family. I thanked Daniel and ended the call. Then I stood alone in the pasture for several minutes looking across the land. Wind moved through the grass. Cattle grazed in the distance. Nothing looked different, yet everything felt different. For months, uncertainty had hung over every acre. Now it was gone. Later that day, Rebecca drove out to the ranch. We sat together on the porch exactly as we had so many times before. "Dad would have loved this," she said. I nodded. He planned for it. That too. We both laughed. The more I thought about it, the more incredible it seemed. My father had protected the ranch years before the divorce existed. Years before Melissa made her claims. Years before anyone imagined this legal battle. He understood something many people forget. Preparation often matters more than reaction. A few days later, I received a message from Melissa. It was short, respectful, surprisingly calm. She did not argue about the ruling, did not blame anyone, did not attempt to reopen old disputes. Instead, she acknowledged the outcome and wished me well. Reading the message, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not satisfaction, closure. The truth was that our marriage had ended long before the courtroom became involved. The legal battle merely exposed realities that already existed. People often imagine victories create happiness. Sometimes they simply create endings. And endings can be valuable too. As weeks passed, life gradually returned to normal. The legal documents were filed away. The attorneys moved on to other cases. Friends stopped asking questions. Neighbors found new topics to discuss. The story that once consumed my entire life slowly became a memory. Yet one lesson remained. The ranch was never saved by luck. It was never saved by a clever speech or a dramatic courtroom moment. It was saved by responsibility. By a father who understood the importance of protecting family history. By records preserved carefully over generations. By people who recognize that some things are worth safeguarding long before they appear threatened. Several months later, I visited the old storage building where everything changed. The compartment beneath the floor remained exactly where I found it. So did the memory of opening that hidden box for the first time. Standing there, I finally understood why my father never explained everything directly. Some lessons must be discovered. They become more valuable that way. Before leaving, I looked across the ranch one final time. More than a century of family history stretched before me. Not because ownership documents said so. Because generations of people invested their lives into preserving it. Money matters. Property matters. Legal victories matter. But none of those things represented the true value of Carter Ranch. The real value was continuity. Legacy. The ability to hand something meaningful to the next generation and trust they will protect it as carefully as those who came before. As the sun began setting across the Texas horizon, golden lights spread over the fields exactly as it had for decades. Exactly as it would for years to come. And for the first time since this story began, I looked toward the future without uncertainty. The ranch remained home. The legacy survived. And somewhere beyond the pastures and fences, I imagined my father smiling because the document he protected all those years ago had done exactly what he intended it to do.